It began quietly, the way most world-changing moments do, not with explosions or alarms, but with a strange, uneasy silence as 2026 arrived, a silence that felt heavier than celebration. Because while fireworks faded across much of the world, Iran was already unraveling beneath the surface, weighed down by years of sanctions, a collapsing currency, empty markets, and a population exhausted by survival. And in the first days of January, that pressure finally broke as protests spread through Tehran, Isfahan, Mashhad, and countless unnamed streets where ordinary people stepped into history without meaning to, their voices rising against a system they felt had closed every door. And the response was swift and unforgiving, with the government cutting internet access, silencing phones, and plunging entire regions into digital darkness, as if unseen suffering might somehow stop existing. And in that darkness, arrests multiplied, gunfire echoed, and lives disappeared, not as numbers, but as faces that would be remembered only by families. While far beyond Iran's borders, powerful nations watched closely, measuring words, weighing consequences, sensing that this unrest was no longer contained, that it was becoming something larger, something dangerous, something capable of pulling the world into a story it had been trying to avoid. As the blackout deepened inside Iran, the outside world began to lean closer, straining to see through fragments of footage, leaked messages, and whispered reports. And among those watching most closely was the United States, where officials spoke carefully but firmly about human rights, red lines, and consequences, their statements calm on the surface yet heavy with implication, while Iran's leadership responded with warnings of their own, declaring that any foreign interference would be treated as an act of war, that American forces, allies, and regional assets would become legitimate targets if pressure turned into action. And suddenly the unrest of one nation began to feel like a fuse connected to a much larger device, as military analysts spoke quietly about naval movements, about bases placed on alert, about the Strait of Hormuz, that narrow stretch of water through which the world's energy flows. And oil markets trembled not from what had happened, but from what might, while diplomats worked behind closed doors, searching for language that could slow momentum without appearing weak. And across social media, where access still existed, people sensed it too, that familiar modern dread, the feeling that history was accelerating again, that decisions made in quiet rooms might soon shape lives far away from any battlefield. None of this was happening in isolation, because the world remembered what had come before: the airstrikes of 2025, the missile exchanges, the fragile ceasefires, the sense that deterrence had thinned to a thread. And those memories shaped every calculation being made in early 2026, as military forces adjusted positions without announcement, as intelligence agencies tracked movements without headlines, and as leaders spoke publicly of restraint while privately preparing for escalation, knowing that modern wars rarely begin with declarations, but with miscalculations, misunderstandings, and moments where silence is mistaken for weakness. And inside Iran, the protests continued despite fear, despite loss, despite knowing that every night could bring arrests or worse. While outside Iran, governments faced their own pressures, torn between avoiding war and responding to brutality, between diplomacy and deterrence. And the longer the crisis stretched on, the more it began to feel less like a sudden emergency and more like a slow descent, a controlled fall towards something no one openly wanted but few seemed able to stop. By mid-January, the effects were no longer confined to borders or maps as protests erupted in foreign cities. Diaspora communities gathered, voices clashed, and even distant streets felt the tremor of events unfolding thousands of miles away. While markets reacted nervously, shipping routes grew tense, and conversations shifted from if escalation would happen to how it might begin. And at the United Nations, debates echoed with familiar divisions, some calling for accountability, others warning against interference, their words filling chambers while events on the ground moved faster than resolutions ever could. And through it all, the modern world continued its strange routine, people waking up, going to work, scrolling through updates, trying to live normal lives while sensing that something fundamental was changing, that the global order felt thinner, less stable, as if the systems built to prevent catastrophe were being quietly tested, stretched, and strained beyond comfort. And so, as the first weeks of 2026 passed, the world found itself standing at the edge of a story still being written, one where multiple endings remained possible, where diplomacy might yet cool tempers, where internal change could reshape futures, or where a single spark could turn tension into open conflict, disrupting energy supplies, redrawing alliances, and pulling entire regions into chaos. And what made this moment especially unsettling was not the noise of war, but its absence. The calm before action, the careful language, the waiting, because history shows that the most dangerous moments are not always loud, but quiet. When leaders hesitate, populations endure, and the world holds its breath, uncertain whether the next chapter will be written in negotiations or in fire. And as night fell across different time zones, one truth became impossible to ignore, that this was no longer just Iran's story or America's story, but a global one, unfolding slowly, deliberately, and without a clear ending, leaving humanity once again wondering how close it truly was to crossing a line it might never be able to step back from. While headlines began to thin and public attention drifted, the machinery of power never slept, because beneath the surface of calm statements and cautious diplomacy, quiet movements were underway. Fleets repositioned without announcement, air defenses were tested, intelligence channels hummed with intercepted signals and shadow assessments. And in command rooms far from public view, scenarios were discussed not as possibilities, but as timelines, each one ending with consequences no one wanted to own. While in Iran the streets grew quieter, not because anger had faded, but because fear had settled in, the kind of fear that forces people indoors while resentment deepens unseen. And this imbalance between silence and tension created a dangerous illusion of stability, one that history has repeatedly shown to be fragile, because when pressure builds without release, it does not disappear, it waits, and the world, distracted by daily routines, failed to notice how close it was drifting to a moment where restraint might be replaced by reaction. What made early 2026 especially fragile was not ideology or ambition, but miscalculation. The risk that a single incident, a naval confrontation, a misread radar signal, a retaliatory strike framed as defense, could unravel months of careful positioning in minutes. Because modern conflict no longer needs intent to ignite, only proximity and mistrust. And with multiple actors operating in tight spaces across land, sea, and air, the margin for error had grown dangerously thin. While leaders on all sides spoke of avoiding war, even as their preparations suggested they no longer trusted words alone. And this contradiction hung over the world like a low cloud, creating a shared unease that could be felt in markets, in diplomatic pauses, and in the quiet way governments advise citizens to stay alert without explaining why. And for those watching closely, it became clear that history was no longer accelerating forward, but tightening inward, compressing time, reducing options, making every decision heavier than the last. And so the story continued without resolution, stretching forward into uncertainty, with no clear climax, no announcement of peace, no declaration of war, only the uneasy continuation of a world waiting for the next line to be crossed, the next statement to harden into action, the next night where nothing happens but everyone expects something might. And this waiting, this prolonged tension, proved to be its own kind of conflict, one that exhausted populations, strained alliances, and tested the belief that humanity had learned enough from its past to step back from familiar mistakes. And as weeks passed and seasons began to shift, one truth settled in quietly, that the most defining chapters of modern history are often written not in moments of chaos, but in moments like this, when the world pauses, listens to the silence, and wonders whether the next sound will be a voice calling for restraint, or the distant echo of something far harder to stop.